So we said that clusters of stars can be born at the same time within the same cloud or giant molecular cloud. And those stars will have an assortment of masses. But all stars, as long as they're not failed stars or they're not too massive, will start in, when they turn on, when they begin fusion in their core, it will be as main sequence stars. They will be fusing hydrogen into helium in the cores of those stars. Now, depending upon their mass, if they're low mass or high mass stars, they'll have a different evolution then after main sequence. So I didn't see in my notes anywhere where I defined what a low mass star is, but for purposes of this discussion right now, low mass stars would be those that are 8 solar masses or lighter. And this is a kind of a nice little figure from your textbook, kind of from left to right. It's showing you some of the things that we've already talked about. So for instance, we talked about protostars. A star starts out as a protostar, then it rises at the main sequence. The next stage is the red giant star, and then we're going to talk more about these stages. But notice the last stage of a low mass star is a white dwarf, and we talked about white dwarfs on the HR diagram. So this is kind of a neat little applet, I think. I'm going to go ahead and open this up. And it just reminds you of one of the things we talked about, that stars on the main sequence, the more massive the star, the faster it will live its life on the main sequence. So this is all going to be looking at the main sequence stage of a life, main sequence stage of the life of a star. So one of the things I can control down here is the mass of the star. This happens to be a star that's 3.16 solar masses. So if I begin this, you can see the hydrogen is converted to helium. You can see the time lapsed and the luminosity of that particular star. All right, so let's go ahead and let's look at a more massive star, 100 solar masses. Isn't that neat? You see, I don't know if you can tell, but the conversion is a lot faster for that core to turn into, basically, all of its hydrogen is converted to helium. Let's go to a light star, 0.1 solar masses. This takes a lot longer, and the luminosity is a lot less. So remember, there's as a star is in its main sequence stage, there's that mass-luminosity relationship. And we said that massive stars live their lives very quickly. So again, these are focusing on low mass stars, 8 solar masses or less. And the star will, what we say, leave the main sequence on the HR diagram, and it will move up into this region where it is what? Cooler and more luminous. Basically, it's going to do that because it expands. This is what we call the red giants, or the red giant stage. And why is it that it swells? Well, this is a star as it's on the main sequence, where the red in the center is we have hydrogen being converted to helium. Well, when that star runs out of hydrogen in its core to fuse into helium, when it's basically got a core of helium now that's left, gravity starts to win out and the star contracts. And it's a little bit confusing, but the inside of the star contracts, but the outside of the star swells. And actually, as the inside of the star contracts, what will happen, I don't know if you can see it, but contraction will cause a fresh layer of hydrogen around the core to go ahead and begin fusing into helium. We call that shell hydrogen fusion. But that shell hydrogen fusion is not enough to go ahead and stop the force of gravity pounding in on the core of that star. Now again, like the center is contracting, but the outside is expanding. So it takes a while, but ultimately in these generally low mass stars, 8 solar masses or lighter, that the conditions in the core will become sufficiently hot and sufficiently dense to go ahead and begin fusing helium into carbon and lots of energy. So this occurs at a higher core temperature than the hydrogen fusion. But oftentimes this turning back on again, I guess I should say, to go ahead and fuse helium into carbon, it does not happen smoothly. It kind of happens all at once. We call a helium flash, where the core says, all right, I'll go ahead and fuse helium into carbon. I'll come out of retirement. So what we have at that stage is something that looks like this, where the pink now is the core of the star that's become sufficiently hot to go ahead and begin fusing helium into carbon, and we still have that region beyond the core where we have what we call shell hydrogen fusion. And actually, right now, when it's reestablished itself with a nice steady flow of helium fusion into carbon in its core, it's at a new sort of equilibrium. But this stage of the star's life is significantly shorter than it was as the star was on the main sequence. So here we have an HR diagram, and kind of showing you where a star, maybe the one solar mass, would leave the HR diagram, go up to become a subgiant, red giant. Down here, we're going to call this where you see it's yellow again. That's where it's reestablished a new equilibrium. For a short time, it's that core helium fusion into carbon. Well, we're going to see here in a minute, I'm going to talk you through that it runs out of helium to fuse into carbon. Basically, it has a core of carbon, and it expands up here again and to another red giant, and eventually it's going to move down here, cool off, and become what we call a white dwarf. And I'll talk you through that. So when that new equilibrium I mentioned, where now the core is fusing helium into carbon, now the star hangs out in a region of the HR diagram we call the horizontal branch. And this is just to simply remind you, I think we looked at this animation maybe back in the previous chapter, but the higher mass stars, main sequence stars, will leave the main sequence first, and it kind of peels off over time. So remember, we can use HR diagrams then to estimate the age of a group of stars. Oops. I think I had that slide a minute ago. All right. So eventually the core, eventually within the core of that star that's fusing helium to form carbon, it's going to run out of helium. And when it runs out of helium, just like when it ran out of hydrogen, it's going to go ahead and gravity's going to win out, and gravity's going to go ahead and make that star's core contract. And it will never contract to make the core's temperature hot enough to begin fusing carbon, because the star is not massive enough. But what it will do is to go ahead then in a region outside of the, how do I say this, in a region outside of the carbon core, it will get hot enough to go ahead and in that shell region begin fusing fresh helium to carbon. So then we end up with two shell fusions. We have the outer shell fusion of hydrogen to helium, and then we have the inner shell fusion of helium to carbon, and then we have the solid carbon core. And then in this place, it's a little bit unstable. It's kind of, sometimes this is a type of variable star. It kind of, these double shell fusion is kind of an interesting sort of thing. So here we have something we call planetary nebula. And planetary nebula have nothing to do with planets, but they are instead a low mass star that is kind of sloughing off its outer layers. It is gravity, it's lost, gravity can no longer hold its outer layers, and it makes these beautiful things we call planetary nebula. The reason they are called planetary nebula is historically when astronomers would see these objects, they'd think they look like planets. So if we could see in in the middle of a planetary nebula should be a retired star. These are basically orbs of carbon, and then outside the carbon we can have helium and then hydrogen. Planetary nebula take on kind of different shapes. Aren't these cool? That's very beautiful. Eventually the planetary nebula cools down and is just kind of another nebula out there. So as I said, oops, sorry, let me go back. The low mass stars, low mass being 8 solar masses or less, will never, even though gravity heats up the core will never become sufficiently hot or dense to go ahead and begin fusing that carbon. And this, I'll go ahead and show you this one. This is, remember that our sun has been fusing hydrogen into helium in its core for about 5 billion years. And because of its initial mass, it has another 5 billion years to fuse hydrogen into helium in its core. So it'll be a main sequence star for another 5 billion years. But after that, here you go. We said it'll expand to be a giant. It looked like it was zooming out to about 1 AU, the distance between the, well, come on back. Let's leave it with this is what others will view our sun as. Isn't that cool? This is like in another, well, it'll be more than 5 billion years, but Planetary Nebula, retired star, our sun. So just to kind of summarize, I think your author's done a good job here. To show you what's happening in the cores of these stars, remember after the sun, or after any low mass star leaves the main sequence, one of the first things it will do is something called shell hydrogen fusion, shown here in white. Then eventually it will begin, the helium will begin fusing in its core to form carbon, and we'll still have that shell hydrogen fusion. And then up here, now we have the outer shell hydrogen fusion, the inner shell helium fusion, and the inert carbon core. And then, like I said, it's going to just kind of, from there, it's going to kind of cool off, give us a planetary nebula. That nebula will stop glowing eventually, and all we'll see is the white dwarf. So I don't think your textbook, the one I'm using this semester, emphasizes this, but I kind of wanted to mention the lowest of the low mass stars, and it's kind of in addition to what we've talked about. Actually, if a star is massive enough to begin hydrogen fusion in its core, so it's more massive than 0.08 solar masses, but it's really pretty light, so less than 0.4 solar masses, what will happen is something like this. The fusion in its core will be so kind of gentle and so long lasted, because remember these light stars last forever, that actually over the course of time, fresh hydrogen will kind of convect into the core, and the used helium will convect out. And so in this way, it kind of ultimately converts its entire orb or its entire mass from hydrogen to helium. And in this sort of the lightest of the low mass stars, actually we don't get what I described earlier in this part. We will not get the formation of helium into carbon in the core. So I just kind of mentioned that these are called red dwarfs, and these red dwarfs will be main sequence stars for, I think your textbook says, trillions of years.